Krishnan, we are ready to go.
Ready? Morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second session of the day. This is a paper on what made Indian cities and towns grow in the 2000s, Stylized, Facts and Determinants. The authors are Rana, Hasan, Jiang and Debolina, Kundu. All are here. The presentation will be done by Rana. Yeah, and I don't want to spend too long introducing the paper. Rana is going to be presenting it. It's been circulated. You've seen it. Just a couple of quick remarks. The paper is basically, to my knowledge, the first effort seriously to link census data, and in this case, census data of 2001 and 2011 on population growth with city-level economic characteristics. It's very painstaking and using location information in the economic census of 2005 to allocate firms to cities. It's not an easy task. Those of you who've dealt with these numbers know that's an enormously, it's a manual sort of very painstaking allocation work. And the robustness has been sort of checked by testing correlations of employment distribution. I'm quoting the paper here. Correlations of employment distribution across the 44 two-digit industries across the NSS, EUS and EC. Now, I have some comments on some of the activities that have been talked about, but presumably these will come up in the discussions, and if there is need, I'll come back to it. The key findings are summarized in pages 16 to 19, and I'm sure Rana will take us through those key findings. There are some policy lessons that are drawn, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss about that one policy experiment which is done in some detail in the paper. But even before he starts, let me make my bias very clear. I think given the sort of general paucity of serious empirical data-based work on urban, this is an excellent beginning. It's a great effort. Over to Rana. You have 30 minutes starting now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Krishnan, for those remarks. And before I start, I do have to really thank Shekhar. Shekhar contacted us a couple of months ago, maybe 3 months ago, and wanted to know whether we had some additional work on manufacturing. It's a sector I'd been working on, and I mentioned to him that no, but we were beginning to look at urbanization issues, and maybe next year we would love it if Shekhar would contact us again a year later. And Shekhar said, look, this is it's now or never. Actually, he was not that blunt. He was extremely kind. He said, look, what's the issue? So I talked to our co-authors, and we did have a team at NIUA. I don't know if Arvind Pandey is here, and a couple of people in Manila who were really trying to put these data together, and everyone said no. This cannot be done in 3 months. And Shekhar said, look, can we help you put this stuff together? And somehow that just emboldened us. And I remembered the experience we had at the IPF many years ago with the work on labor regulations and employment. And we got such fantastic comments from the discussion that I thought, let's risk this and go for it. So Shekhar, thank you very much for that. Now, just very quickly, I'll just give a bit of the background and motivation, and then get on to the results. This is preliminary work. It's just data that we're still putting together. But the background and motivation, I think, are probably clear to everyone. Wherever you read about urbanization and economic growth issues, you hear about cities as engines of growth and engines of better jobs. In fact, I think the World Development Report of 2013, one of the central messages it had was that if you're interested in the issues of job creation, creating better jobs, jobs that pay better, jobs that are in more productive firms, you can sit and think about labor regulations and different types of policies, but it seems to be the case at cities. The real action is cities, and it's cities that seem to be creating jobs. And that's how we got interested in this issue of urbanization, actually. It was really coming in through that jobs angle. But as we dug a bit deeper, it was quite clear from the recent literature that the experience that the developed countries had with urbanization, where urbanization was pretty much synonymous with economic growth, higher incomes, higher productivity, was something that was bypassing certain parts of the developing world. There are a couple of people who have been talking about this, a number of people, but Vernon Henderson was probably one of the early people who were talking about the different forms of urbanization that we're seeing in the developing world. And he picked up on one type which he called the self-organized cities. And essentially, it seemed to us that this, what he was trying to say is that these are cities which are really, it's a very messy process. Going on. You're seeing agglomerations, you're seeing people coming together, but is it going to give you all this good stuff in terms of agglomeration economies and better firms? Far from clear. There's some recent work by Douglas Golan and his collaborators who have been looking at cross-country data. And basically they break down the urbanization experience in recent years in terms of urbanization that's driven by consumption cities, urbanization that's driven by what they call production cities. And basically production cities are ones which are cities where you see a lot of tradable production going on. So whether it's manufacturing or tradable services like in finance, real estate, insurance, business services, etc., and other types of cities where you see a lot of non-tradable economic activity going on. And interestingly, you see population increases in both types of cities, but only one of them seems to be very clearly correlated with other things that we think are good for growth and good for welfare. So this was the motivation, the starting point, and we were asking the question about India, India's urbanization process, cities in India. Is it the case that the urbanization process we see in India, will it be good for growth? Will it generate more productive, better paying jobs? So from this chart over here, we see that India's urbanization rate has been growing over time. It's not as much as we've seen in China, Indonesia, Thailand recently, but there's debate about how urbanization is measured in the Indian context, etc. That's something we don't want to get into. I think what's really just important in terms of the motivation about why this is important is that all indicators are that the urbanization process is just going to be continuing, and about by 2050, the UN has some model-based estimates. You could perhaps see about 50% of the country residing in urban areas. Now, there's been growing concern, and I think this concern started to be expressed probably about 7 to 8 years ago. We had Ishwar Ahluwalia, Ravi Kanbur, and others who came together and published a very nice edited volume that looked at different aspects of Indian urbanization. There was, of course, the HPEC, that high-powered committee on urbanization that Ishwar Ahluwalia was also in charge of. Debolina has done a considerable amount of work in this area. The Government of India's Planning Commission documents back in 2011. Each of these different agencies, authors, have been stressing the fact that India may be losing a big opportunity. So you are seeing urbanization in the sense of populations moving to urban areas, or just the population in current urban areas expanding, but it's not going to be associated with all those other good things. So why might that be? Issues of urban infrastructure. So there's that famous McKinsey report which says that Indian cities invest about $10 per capita on urban infrastructure, and on the other hand, you see Chinese cities spending about $100. There's been concern expressed about the planning processes, economic spatial planning processes, and there's been also people who've been calling out to the issue of the governance frameworks. So for example, the bluntest way to put this is you compare an Indian mayor with his or her counterpart in China. One has a lot of authority over different agencies, a lot of incentives towards economic development, and the other one really does not operate in that same type of environment. Now, just turning to the empirical literature on India, it is small, but it is growing. Until very recently, a lot of the work on urbanization was actually being done at the district level. So instead of dealing with cities and towns, the data that was available was really at the district level, and you could look at urban districts and do various types of things. So what were some of those things? There's a paper by Chauvin et al., Ed Glaser being one of the co-authors here, on the importance of urban agglomeration economies. And so using data on urban districts, what they find is an elasticity of about 7 to 8% of nominal wages to district urban density. So that's actually quite high. In fact, they point out that this is higher than the U.S., and they're actually surprised by how high this is. On the other hand, there's some prior work by Shomik Lal at the World Bank who used ASI data and basically found that basically not much benefit from co-locating in a dense urban area. But once again, this was at the district level. And then finally, more recently, Ijaz Ghani and his collaborators have been, they've carried out a series of papers, and one of them is quite related to parts of this paper on, and what they look at is they ask whether the structure of economic activity at a district level influences employment growth. There is a prior literature for developed countries which finds that it is indeed the case that where you have a very diverse manufacturing base or diverse manufacturing and services base, those are the places that see rapid employment growth. And there are sub-debates on whether certain types of cities do better having a more diversified industrial structure versus cities that might be benefiting from having very specialized industries. But one of the big puzzles in the Ghani paper is that the good things that flow from a diverse industrial structure, they tend to be driven by rural India. So it's sort of puzzling compared to the other studies. And one takeaway might be that something's going wrong with the urbanization process in India. One of the things that they point to is the possibility that land is being, perhaps I guess I can use the word mismanaged in some sense, so that land prices are just extremely high, higher than what you would expect them to be, and so firms are just moving off. It's just too expensive to operate in cities. Now, more recently, you have studies which are emerging at the city level, and I think just in the last couple of months, there seem to be several papers. So there's a paper this by Alder, Mark Roberts at the World Bank, and Minu Tiwari, who look at this issue of transport infrastructure and city-urban growth. Together with Yi and another colleague, we've been looking at the issue of these urban agglomeration economies. You might remember I just mentioned that Ed Glaser and Chauvin, they've been looking at agglomeration economies at the district level. And so what we decided to do with this data was to just try and see what happens when you go from the district level to the city level. And interestingly, what we find is at the district level, we find results which are similar to those of Ed Glaser and collaborators. But when we go down to the city level, these agglomeration economies start to wash away. A third paper, third issue, and I think extremely interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, if, hopefully if there's time. These researchers, they've started using satellite image data, and they're trying to capture elements about the shape and form of cities. And the shape and form of cities is important because if you're talking about agglomeration economies, about people and firms benefiting from one another, then it doesn't really help if the city structure is such, the transportation is so poor, that you've got people maybe in the north and south sides of the town and not really able to travel easily to one another, communicate easily with one another, interact easily with one another. So that kind of work can really only be done by the satellite-based data, and that is really one of the, it seems to be the state of the art in this literature. So just some quick takeaways from this literature. First of all, the unit of analysis seems to matter. And as I mentioned, when we look at the district level versus when we look at the city-town level, we're finding different results in terms of agglomeration economies. So that suggests to us that this effort of using, whether it's the satellite data or whether it's the economic census data, it seems to be a worthwhile effort. Okay, now what do we do here? We just take a step back. Some of these papers have gotten into very specific hypotheses, like the relationship between urban form and economic growth. So we're not there yet in terms of looking at stuff like that. We take a step back and we use a traditional set of data sources, but these are ones that are rarely used together, the population census data and the economic census data. And we examine urbanization over 2001 and 2011. Urbanization is defined for us as simply population growth. Now, that is a limitation of the study. When you think about urban success, you think about not just having more people in a city, but you also think in terms of higher incomes, higher productivity. So over here, we're not able to do that. Implicitly, we are assuming that places that are seeing high urban growth might also be seeing higher incomes. But it is something I'll get back to a little later on. So essentially, what we're doing is we're looking at this urban growth, and we're trying to see what are, at this stage, really correlates of city size and urban growth. And the kinds of variables we look at are the ones that the literature has been saying are quite important. Infrastructure, connectivity issues, human capital, and the economic structure. Just a word on the literature for India. As far as we know, this seems to be the first time somebody's tried to do this. For other developing countries, of course, there are examples. There's work on Brazil, there's work on Colombia, but in terms of city level examination, we, as far as we know, people have not used these two data sets together. Very quickly, just the main results. So you do see in the data, and this is also something that's clear from the official census reports, that there's been this huge growth of small towns in India, the so-called census towns, between 2001 and 2011. And nevertheless, what we find is that the big increases in population that you're seeing over time, they're being driven by the large cities. So no doubt the number of small towns is expanding dramatically, but because the big cities already have so many people, growth there just means that it's going to drive urbanization. We also find that larger cities score higher on measures of human capital, so more literate people, and better infrastructure access, more diverse economic structures, larger share of employment in formal firms, and some of these variables are quite closely correlated to measures of productivity or wages. So for example, if you take largest share of employment in formal firms, and for us, a formal firm is any firm with 10 or more workers. So what you can do is you can go and look at the NSS employment unemployment data, and you see very clearly that larger firms pay more, even when you control for observables like levels of education, experience, etc. So in that sense, it does seem to be the case that larger cities would have better outcomes for workers. However, when it comes to city growth, what seems to matter differs. Very surprisingly, we find that our measures of human capital and city level infrastructure, so for example, that's number of electricity connections, or just the number of road length in terms of kilometers, they don't seem to matter. They're quite poorly correlated, in a case or two even negatively and significantly. But on the other hand, connectivity to other cities comes out quite strongly. Essentially what we seem to be finding is that an economic environment that's conducive to manufacturing and especially new firm formation seem to be much better predictors of urban growth. So in other words, if you have a city where you're seeing lots of new firms coming up in 1998, if you see more manufacturing employment, those are the cities which are going to be growing faster in terms of population. So the bottom line is that the results do seem to be consistent with this idea that Indian cities or Indian urbanization is, Indian cities are centers of production, and they're not just centers of consumption as we seem to be seeing from the African data. And so helping cities work as labor markets, helping economic activity in cities is probably something for policy. And I'll just note one thing here, and maybe it'll come up in the discussion, that when we've gone through these urban policy documents, we don't see, we see piecemeal, we see issues that are, of course, related to helping cities work as labor markets, but nothing too direct. There's stuff on affordable housing, but it's the different things that are being talked about, the sanitation, etc. They're not being connected to looking at the city as a center for economic activity. Now, coming to the data. So the population census, as I'm sure that there's several people in this room who have worked with population census very closely. They don't provide micro records, but they do provide what are called the town directories. And the town directories contain a lot of information about, of course, demography, but also things on the kilometers of road in a town, the percentage of households, firms with electricity, literacy rates, etc. There's also something called a primary census abstract, which basically also identifies not just towns, but two types of urban centers that are classified as urban centers: urban agglomerations and outgrowths. And urban agglomerations are very important for us. So an urban agglomeration is basically a statutory town. In fact, it could be two statutory towns, but these are considered as one urban agglomeration because there are fairly deep connections between these two locations. So, and an urban agglomeration, when it combines towns and outgrowths, it's got to be contiguous. You can't have an urban agglomeration which is a single agglomeration but divided by some space in between. So in other words, urban agglomerations are combining statutory towns plus areas that are basically revenue villages. We thought that it was extremely important to work with urban agglomerations and not just the standalone towns, because the urban footprint is of course extending beyond towns. And I have to say that on this issue, probably the use of satellite data is probably a better way. One of the big efforts that we're going to continue now, after this, is really just looking more closely at these urban agglomerations, the matches that we have been making between the 2011 and 2001 town directories. And the way the spatial data captures this is through night light. So wherever you see a clump of lights all together, that you define it as one urban center. Now, coming to the economic census data, so in this paper we're just looking at 1998. The economic census, it basically covers all establishments in all activities except crop production and plantation. It provides location ID variables at state, district, city, towns. And the nice thing is that for establishments, it doesn't provide a whole lot of information, and it can't. I mean, it's a census. The amount of time that it would take, it's probably inconceivable that you could collect information on revenues and assets, etc. So it gives just a few key variables. It allows you to figure out how many employees, how many workers there are, both hired and non-hired. And it tells you, of course, the industry of main activity of the establishment or enterprise that's being covered. And in the 1998 data, but not after that, there's a variable called years of operation, which we use as a proxy for age. Then there's information on registration status and ownership type. Now, what we do in a lot of our work is we just focus on 44 industries. We look at 22 manufacturing industries, 22 service sectors. The ones we omit in this analysis are like public administration, defense, domestic health, etc. We have been experimenting with a different measure, which is basically manufacturing and tradable services. We wouldn't present you anything over here today, but essentially the results seem very close to the results we get from just using manufacturing. And maybe that's not surprising, because if you're thinking about tradable employment and tradable activities, a big chunk of that is being driven by manufacturing. Okay, now for road connectivity. So here we use some of this GIS spatial data that's becoming accessible. We do two things. One, we just compute straight line distance from a city or town center to the nearest state highway or to the nearest national highway or expressway, and we consider these two differently. And we do this for 2001, so that's our initial year. And for market access, this is the idea that if you are close to a large town with a large population, that means potentially for your activities, there's a huge market out there. So what we do is we take the 74 largest cities with a population above 500,000 in 2001, and we compute this measure on market access. So essentially, you're weighting the population of a location by inversely related to the distance between you and that location. Okay, in terms of the matching, this was really a tough task. I think we've done a fairly decent job so far, but there are some issues to check, and we do plan to do that. Basically, as such, it seems a simple job. You just use town IDs to merge town directories. But in fact, you actually, especially when you're trying to get into this issue of composition of urban agglomerations, that's where the tasks become tricky, and you have to find out what the constituent towns of an urban agglomeration are, and then go back to these town directories and see how to aggregate these urban agglomerations. Now, when we when we linked up these cities and urban agglomerations, we looked at the population growth rates, there were some real clear outliers. And so we used a trimming process. So population growth rates above or below a certain threshold, and area growth graded and below certain levels were dropped. And the final data set we've been working with is about 2,400 cities and towns. These belong to 502 districts across 21 states and 4 union territories. Now, just some quick comparisons. If you look at the table on the top and the stuff to your left, these are the official numbers from the population of census reports. And if you just look at what I've circled, what you'll see is that the growth in the urban population between 2001 and 2011, about 22.6% is coming from cities that are classified as having population sizes of 100,000 and below. 100,000 above count for 77.4. If you go to the extreme right, our sample, it's sort of there, a little different. About 18.6% from these below 100,000 urban centers, which I think the common terminology is to call them towns. So towns contribute for 18.6%. Cities and urban agglomerations account for about 81%. The table below takes this information, cuts it down by the 4 size classes we have been considering. And again, you see fairly similar numbers. So our sample at this level of aggregation seems to be doing a reasonably good job. So again, class 1, these are cities, 77% versus 81%. Class 2, which is 50,000 to 99,000 population towns, 6% for the official numbers, 6.7 for us. Class 3 and 4, these are really small towns, 16.6% for the official numbers, 11.9 for our sample. Now, I have to point out here that if you actually broke down class 1 into 100 to 500, 500 to million and above, it's not as good. This match, the comparison between our sample and what you see from the population census there can be some big differences. It's something we have to look into more, and just in terms of thinking of how that might bias some of our results, and just in terms of presenting stylized facts on what's driving city growth. In terms of the city distributions, this is what the densities look like. So essentially, you see that you've got this blue and green plots. These are for 2001 low income and high income. So this is not in the paper, but we thought it'd be interesting to just split up Indian states using, just divide them into low income, high income, and you find that the high income, these are cities in the high income are a little bigger, and in both cases, cities have expanded. Now, in terms of just a scatter plot of initial population versus population growth, this is what the numbers look like. And despite our trimming, you do see some plots out there, extremely high population growth. And so it turns out that one of the highest is actually Gurgaon. So it's an urban agglomeration, and you see this almost 300% increase in population. And at least, when we combine all these constituent towns and treat Gurgaon as an urban agglomeration, the area is expanding a lot also. And I think this point is important to keep in mind because, when we were starting this work, one of the questions we asked each other is, why are we even studying this? If city population growth is essentially driven by natural increases, why would you assume that fertility rates are higher where manufacturing employment is higher? I mean, you could think of a link, but it's not very interesting. So what was important for our study to have more meaning is if the expansion in city population is also driven by migration. Now, we know from the data that migration in India is not all that high compared to many other developing countries, but the good news here is that I think we're also capturing some passive migration. So in a sense, you're located in some place, and wow, is that that's zero?
Yes.
That's it.
Okay, I better move much faster. Can I get 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Oh. Basically, the story here from these summary statistics is that all these the numbers are very, very plausible. So you see literacy rates are higher in bigger cities. You see the diversity index. So for manufacturing, and this is true also for services. I haven't presented it here, but more diverse industrial structures, economic structures are to be found in cities. More employment in bigger firms, so whether it's 10 plus firms with 10 plus workers, 100 plus workers, that's where they are. Again, we think that's important because now you're starting to capture formal employment and employment in larger firms which should be more productive, should be paying higher wages. I'll just skip this. Basically, again, just reinforcing the message, you do see these human capital measures positively associated with size. You see slightly better infrastructure within city, but really not much of a relationship there. This issue of distance through expressways, though, the bigger you are, the much closer you are to an expressway or national highway, and then market access in these, there's no real difference. And that's because you could be a small town located close to Bangalore. So here, not surprisingly, no real relationship. In terms of, now let me just get to city growth. In terms of city growth, the empirical framework we use is it's a very simple one, and we do a difference on levels. So we just take log differences in population, we regress that on initial population and initial values of a whole bunch of these variables. Causality in this literature, extremely difficult to, you either need, typically what people do is they use historical values of city level variables. And I think, quite frankly, with the exception of population, I'm not optimistic that we would actually be able to find city level historical data. On demography and migration, just a very limited point. It doesn't seem to be driving much of population growth, but it's not completely irrelevant. That's good news for us because it suggests that there is some migration. It's not much. So perhaps our story of the passive migration is important. City growth and human capital, extremely surprising to us, and we don't know whether it's because these variables are just very poorly measured. So, for example, if you look at years of schooling, now this is not actually a city level measure. This years of schooling is taken from NSS data, and it's at the urban district level. We've not been able to find a way of getting years of schooling at the city town level. So maybe that could be explaining this non-result. But essentially, you just really don't see any strong positive relationship at all. In fact, to some extent, it's quite the opposite. City growth and infrastructure. Here, that distance to the expressways and market access quite uniformly and closely correlated, and in the direction that you'd expect. So the closer you are to a highway, the more your market access. So in other words, the closer you are to large towns, the faster you're going to be growing. And final set of results. This is now looking at this issue of economic structure. This is actually what motivated us to start this paper in the first place. And essentially what you find here is that cities and towns with higher manufacturing employment shares in 1998, they grew faster. Same for cities with more diverse manufacturing. It's interesting, when we looked at diverse manufacturing and services, you don't really get that much result. Action. It really something seems to be there about manufacturing, and this issue of young firms. So the higher the proportion of firms which are 5 years or younger in 1998, these are the cities and towns that are going to see the largest expansion in population. And these results, they hold up to our inclusion of other variables. So whether we're controlling for market access, distance to the highway, or this principal components measure of infrastructure, these numbers are still there. We did a little a thought experiment. We said, okay, the most powerful result we're getting is on this young firms. And now let's think of young firms as a firm entry. And suppose there's some policy intervention. One minute. There's a policy intervention which can encourage entrepreneurship in new firms. What does that mean for population growth? And the numbers are here. The interesting thing we find is that you get a much bigger bang in larger cities. So even if you took the same absolute increase in young firms that as in small towns, and you just transfer those new firms to large cities, much bigger bang. What's driving that? At this point, we're just speculating, but it is consistent with one of the papers by Ijaz Ghani. It's a very different paper. He has a paper on entrepreneurship, and the point he makes is that one of the striking things in that paper is that if you're a firm, you want to locate in cities where there are many other firms and a diverse industrial structure. So our results do seem to be consistent with that. I'll just end here. And just first, the good news seems to be that that Indian cities that they are progressing the way in which the traditional literature has looked at urbanization and the relationship between urbanization and growth. And big cities are driving a lot of this dynamism that you seem to be seeing from Indian urbanization. But nevertheless, this doesn't mean you can just ignore small cities. In fact, in some of our regressions, if you just went with a big city bias and you just ignored cities with 100,000 towns with 100,000 people or less, you could miss out on opportunities. And in particular, we see that an intervention that could get manufacturing spurred in these smaller towns and have them just better connected to expressways would give you a lot more. So I'll just leave this slide and just end over here. Maybe some of these issues could come up in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rana. Can I now request our first discussant, Dr. Rakesh Mohan? You have 10 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, KP, and I guess I shouldn't thank Shekhar because he made me do some work which I'm not used to doing anymore. So first, let me congratulate the authors for doing this mountain of work. It's not easy, as I think KP started his own remarks, to put together these large sets of data and then, of course, to match the economic census, the population census, and as Rana said, it's perhaps not been done before. And now, of course, he'll have much more work as the new economic census comes out in 2013-14. So I think you've got 2 or 3 years more that you can continue to work on this happily. It is very careful work, but as a discussant, one always talks about what he didn't do. So let me concentrate on that, on what he didn't do. As I understand, you basically want to understand the determinants of city growth or the urbanization process. What can cities and towns grow in India and how? Your approach is really essentially that of data mining. And that's really the main question that I'm going to raise right through my comments. In some sense, it seems to me that it might have been more useful first to refer, which you did in the beginning of your comments, to the generally accepted theories of urban growth and urbanization, and then to see how the data fit those theories. And such an approach, I would have thought, would first include consideration of what the appropriate unit is for urban growth. Is it indeed cities and towns? Is that the unit that is appropriate for understanding urban growth? Should it be an economy-wide approach? Because after all, from one's understanding of the urbanization process, it's overall economic policies, economic patterns, economic growth, which determined urban growth on the whole. So it might have been useful to start at the macro level and then successively embed the economy-wide findings into more disaggregated framework. And in a sense, what I'm saying is if you could understand the Indian urban growth process, say the last 30, 40, 50 years, and then of course apply that to the most recent decade, and then see that within the overall urban growth process, how is the distribution of growth among towns made? So in some way, a lot of your work in terms of the detail is to do with the distribution of urban growth within the whole urban system. But that's got to be embedded in first understanding the urban growth process on a macro or a country economy-wide basis. That, as I said, one would have thought that the overall urban growth process really determined on economy-wide level, and then given that understanding of the economic determinants, presumably one can then shift some attention to the within economy distribution of that urban growth. It would then be useful to give some consideration to the relevant spatial disaggregation as you've done, and the key issue then is to really think of which are the independent or exogenous variables and policy variables which then determine the spatial distribution. Many of the variables you use, it's not clear which are endogenous and which are exogenous. And again, I think there's a long literature on the exogenous, what are exogenous determinants and what are endogenous determinants. And I mean, I'm sort of going to make it worse in the sense that it might even be instructive to start at the global level and document, and in some sense you don't do that work because others have done that, and document what have you referred to some of these things in the beginning of your remarks. What have been the accepted determinants of urban growth across countries, and what variables have explained the differences across countries that have those that have exhibited higher rates of urbanization than others. Was it just income growth? Was it changes in structural features of the economy, such as higher relative growth in manufacturing or services? You sort of referred that to some extent the production cities and consumption cities, etc. One could then use those insights into understanding what the variations in decadal changes in urban growth in India. One of the interesting things that has indeed happened in India, which you referred to, is first that the highest urban growth rate took place in India between 1971 and 81, and has essentially been slowing down since. And in fact, the slowdown is among your stylized facts. And this has been a constant surprise for the last 30 years on why that it sort of just goes against conventional understanding of development and urbanization. That just, and these are the 30 years when the growth accelerated from the so-called Hindu growth rate in the previous period. And all understanding that we have of urbanization, you expect acceleration of urbanization with acceleration of economic growth. And this did include some acceleration of manufacturing growth. And so as I said, first, if one understands the determinants of the differences in urban growth globally across countries, then we look at the Indian decadal growth rate differences. And then you could perhaps use those insights to do interstate variation, because to some extent the states might be a good units of analysis to understand some of the dispersion of growth across states. Did states that grew faster or have higher manufacturing, etc., growth explain changes, differences in growth rates across those states? So there are a lot of those things that it would then be easier to understand some of the city level work that you've done. The chart the international chart that you showed with some of the other Asian countries did show that slow growth of Indian urbanization. Again, this sort of goes against conventional wisdom in that, as far as one understands, there have actually been widened this issue of migration that you talked about. That net migration has also been slowing down. Net rural-urban migration has been slowing down. That also goes against conventional wisdom during a period over the last 30 years when perhaps the differences between agricultural and non-agricultural wages or incomes has actually been widening. There may be some issues that I'm not sure of whether what I'm saying is correct, that indeed are the rural income levels and urban income levels been widening. My understanding is that they have indeed been widening. That should have led to an acceleration with net rural-urban migration. That hasn't happened. And this is again very different from most other countries that we know of in terms of development urban history. So it seems to me, to repeat, that getting a better understanding of such economy-wide or state-wide determinants of urban and city growth could then be used as appropriate, and looking at the city-level data that you have done. Now, in understanding slowdown in urban population growth, one determinant is naturally the overall slowdown in natural population growth. That, of course, one expects that as Indian natural population growth is slowing down, the natural urban population growth should also be slowing down. But that does not imply that urbanization growth slows down. In fact, it could be the opposite. That as the urban population, natural population growth comes down, you have the possibility of an accelerating per capita income growth in the cities and of course rural areas as well. But with that differential widening, because the family size, etc., in urban areas are smaller than in rural areas, that you then have a possibility of widening of urban-rural differences. So again, you have to ask that question, why has not that happened? One clue is indeed provided by your paper from the finding of the importance of manufacturing in urban growth. And one distinguishing feature of the Indian development in the last 30 years is indeed the slow growth in manufacturing employment, despite acceleration to a certain extent, except in recent years, of the value added and output in manufacturing. And to my mind, this is a key issue in some sense that has come out indeed in your paper. As you've sort of recounted some of the urban policies. Have any of the urban policies promoted manufacturing growth in cities? In fact, we have had the opposite experience in India. All kinds of urban land policies, of course, the labor policies, etc., which have indeed been totally against labor using manufacturing. And really, is that the thing that is dominating explanation of urban of Indian urban growth, in Indian city growth? And then the question is, once you take account of the macro policies, then what are the town and city level policies that you want, town and city level variables that you want to look at? And are the issues to do with efficient operation of factor markets more important, or to do with local infrastructure, human capital endowments, etc.? I'll end with just three specific issues. One specific issue has been in my bonnet for about 40 years. I'm now in the 40-year business, so but it's an important one. One common error, which I'm afraid you have reproduced, is caused by the table the census provides, which is when you look at size classes of towns, you say you take any class, say class 1, you have say 100 cities in class 1 in census 1. Naturally, as all the cities are growing, you then have 120 cities in class 1 in census 2. That goes down the line. There's one big difference is that in every class, some cities or some towns come in and some towns exit to the upper level. At the top level, there's no exit. So you'll always find, if you just compare those non-comparables, which you've done, unfortunately, there's a paper I did 1983, I think, on the 81 census, which did that careful work. It's called a morphology of urbanization in India. And you then get somewhat different understanding of the different processes of growth by city size. And I'm sorry to see that 35 years later, the same error is being made, because that's how the census data come. You have all that that's detailed data, and you can certainly do much better. Second, as I said, in all the various regressions you've done, you really need to do much more careful thinking of what is exogenous and what is endogenous. So, for example, this issue of new firms or new entrepreneurs. Are new entrepreneurs causing higher city growth, or is it the cities that are growing faster, there's greater opportunity for new entrepreneurs? Which way is the causation? What is exogenous? So I think that, and then you say, so look, if you encourage more entrepreneurs to come in, that'll cause higher city growth. I'm not so sure, because then there might be oversupply of entrepreneurs who will be losing their shirts as you get more and more entrepreneurs into the system. So I think really, and this, I'm giving just one example, but you really have to think about what are the exogenous drivers of city growth, which you then put on the right-hand side. One surprising thing I found in the service sectors, you excluded public administration and defense. Now, one of the key determinants of city growth has always been administration and defense. You know, you with the new capital in Telangana, for example, that's going to cause higher city growth. And finally, the surprising result on the technical colleges, you may have the wrong variable then. It seems to me we should be talking about number of students in higher education as a proportion of some unit of population to the number of colleges, because I presume the colleges must be much larger in the larger cities. So I've only gone 3 minutes over, so that's not too bad. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And Dr. Pronab Sen, now you have only 7 minutes. I couldn't restrain. The person who hired me, my first job in Delhi, is thanks to Dr. Rakesh Mohan, so there's no way I'm going to stop him.
Among the many errors I've made.
Thanks, KP. Let me also compliment the authors on a paper I enjoyed thoroughly, and the amount of care that's been taken with the data. It's really very impressive. Now, I have a bit of a disadvantage. Rakesh is an urban economist. I'm not. I'm anything but. But I was glad to find that the paper actually quoted two of the things I happened to write in two of our plans, both of which actually expressed a sense of bewilderment, which is, I think, what they set around trying to explain. So I come here from the perspective of not knowing any answers, but having a lot of questions which have still remained unanswered. So let me try and get to a few of the issues I think you need to take into account. Let's begin with an observation, which is migration does not explain very much of Indian urbanization. You've said that, right? Supposing it doesn't, does it require a complete change in our theory? Because what you've gone and done is you've taken a theory which is essentially based on migration experiences of other countries, and you applied it to a country where migration simply isn't happening. A simple way of actually getting at it is, and in a sense, as I was reading the paper, I thought you would get to it, but you didn't, was when you looked at two different variables, which is growth in population and growth in area, right? Now, if you think of a migration pattern, what happens? You start with a particular geographical area, you have people coming in, then you get spillovers, and neighboring areas then become urbanized. Think of it as a non-migration phenomenon. You have an area which has a certain number of people, and the city is actually absorbing those areas along with the people, which is what is causing your city growth, by the way. All your agglomerations are that. The two are very different, and you have to think about them differently. I'm not sure what is an appropriate theory to handle this kind of a thing, but I'm almost certain that the normal theories which relate wage differences, productivity differences to city growth are probably not relevant. So what I would suggest is that in your next iteration, try and look at the change in the density as cities are growing as an indicator of what's happening. The second point that I'd like to bring to your notice is you need to be extremely careful in terms of what we say about the population. What we do know from the data is, number one, practically the entire in-migration for economic reasons is male. Okay? Men are actually moving from villages into towns. However, if you look at the total migration, the majority are women, where women are moving from villages to towns for marriage purposes. So the economic and the demographic are being driven by two very different factors. Right? So when you are looking at the composition of cities and towns, you need to keep the gender composition in mind as well. You cannot and should not ignore it, because they are, again, as I said, being driven by different factors. The third consideration is a political one. Because at the end of the day, when you're thinking about the governance systems, there is a tension between the way political boundaries are defined. At what stage does an area actually get counted as an urban area in terms of changing the governance structure? how long, what drives the period for which a census town remains a census town instead of becoming a part of a statutory town? What drives it? Until we have answers to some of these, I don't think that we'll have a full picture of India, because India, from the data that I have seen and something I've been puzzling about for 20 years, is we are really like that only. We are different. We've been different, and we really haven't come up with a theory which is also sui generis. We've taken theories developed elsewhere, we've tried to shoehorn them into what data we have, and the net result, of course, we keep getting more puzzles rather than enlightenment. Thank you. I'm well within my time.
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you. We have another 20 plus minutes. Now the floor is open, and request is ask your question, and before you do that, state your name and speak into the mic, because I believe it's being recorded, and I want to read out what Shekhar has circulated to me. Please mercilessly cut off long-winded observations and request the commentator to zero in on the question he wishes to ask, she wishes to ask. If they can't do so, please pass over to the next questioner without compunction. I plan to carry this out faithfully. Now, floor is open. So we'll start from here. Karthik?
No, this is all great. I mean, and I'm sorry to make another request beyond what's already in the paper, but I think the other thing, flip side, we focus on urbanization mainly from a growth and jobs and industries perspective, but I think the other side that's not reflected as much is just how much cheaper it is to deliver services like a meal in higher dense area, in more dense areas. So coming at things from a service delivery perspective, when you want choice and competition and multiple options of providing services, I think it would be really nice if there was a way to just, I mean, maybe that's beyond the scope of the paper, but if there's a way to take a couple of services and seeing, can you benchmark holding quality, like, I mean, how much cheaper it is as a function of spatial density. I think there's a lot of now nice work in the US showing how there's additional value from just the diversity of in the consumption basket that's available in more dense areas. So.
Thanks, Karthik. I think Professor Srinivasan. The mic, sir.
I had several areas of confusion. One of the areas of confusion is what the hell is endogenous and what the hell is exogenous. It was not clear at all throughout the discussion. And Rakesh was the only one who brought that up with some clarity. Second thing is the distinction between birthplace migration and other forms of migration. To what extent these impact on the urbanization story which we are trying to spin, that was not also clear. Third, this so-called new series of national income that have been brought upon us for good or ill in the last several years, that is again is not very clear. Are we talking about prices in the at market prices as in the new series of national account, or are we talking about prices in the factor cost sense in the old way? That is not clear either. What the hell are we talking about?
Is that Devesh? Yeah.
Just a comment on the migration, data. What's interesting is every micro study of villages, and I've seen dozens of them, all say high rates of migration. Every macro study says there's no migration or very little. And how do we understand this very severe mismatch? And I think we really need to ask some hard questions how the census is actually trying to ask and gather data on migration. One of the things we find is as roads have become much better, there's a whole lot of movement, and if you want to change the mindset from migration to mobility or spatial mobility, you find you get very different ways of looking at this at a very similar issue. So for instance, we were looking at Ara and Patna, which is a sort of nearby towns. 20 years ago, it would take about 3 hours to get from Ara to Patna. So you just couldn't work on a daily basis. Now it's about 45 minutes, depending where you work. Roads are much better, or an hour and a half. So you see a lot more of these people going in the morning, coming back in the evening. You see in market towns where the farmer has moved his family to the small town and stays in the farm. Is that a rural household or an urban household? And this is all because of a very rapid increase in the construction of roads. Migration, because it says you were born in place X and now you live in place Y. We've just finished a survey of households in NCR. It's very clear that people hide where they were born. The surveys are abundantly clear. People are afraid of saying that they are not been here for forever, for a variety of reasons. I would be far more cautious in literally taking migration statistics from the census and using that as your primary way of thinking about this issue.
Thanks, Devesh. I'm you here. I couldn't read the name. If you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Rohini Pandey. So thanks. I think the creation of the data set is a lot of work, and it'd be exciting to see the things you'd use it for. I had 2 suggestions. So one, which I think is responding a little bit to Rakesh and TN concerns about indigeneity. One comment you often hear is that India doesn't give urbanization a level playing ground, that a lot of its policies are very rural focused. So between the 2 censuses, the one big thing you saw was NREGA come up. And there are a number of papers that think about ways in which you can use identification, districts that got it early or states that are better performers. That may be one thing that actually has, and people have written about how this has potentially slowed down migration. So I think that may be one way you can try to get some kind of handle on at least some of the migration numbers, and you may want to look at work by Clemma Imbert, who's done a bunch of work on this. The second thing is, I think, I think of India as different, but India is often different in ways that are not very good. So you don't talk at all about things like inequality in any form. I mean, this presumption that there is city growth or agglomeration and that's actually good for manufacturing depends a lot on thinking that those features look similar to other countries. One place where India looks very different from other countries, say China, is not just in kind of slower manufacturing employment, but urban female labor force participation. So urban female labor force participation, like all labor force participation in India, is low, but it's actually 26% lower in urban areas than rural areas, which is very different from other countries. So, I mean, one, in population, you can just cut that data to actually tell us how different things look like. But I think this link from city population growth to economic activity is probably going to look very different. And that's just one cut. I'm sure there are other cuts you can do in terms of how demographics look different. So I think it'd be useful to see those.
Thank you. Dr. Berry?
Suman Berry from Bruegel. 2 quick points. One is that in the Indian discussion on urbanization, the energy dimension tends to get lost. So since you are looking at urban form, or you're using innovative satellite techniques, I think that if you could extend your analysis to, as it were, what different kinds of urban form mean for patterns of energy consumption, that would be helpful. Secondly, speaking for my former employer, NCAER, everything here is about census data, not necessarily now in real time, but if there is data gathering of a sampling kind that an NCR might wish to take up to get at some of those issues, that might be a useful product from this work.
Thank you. Yeah. Person next.
I just have a small empirical comment, but I think one which relates to something Dr. Rakesh Mohan spoke about. If you look at the nightlights data, for example, to define what an urban agglomeration is, under very reasonable assumptions, especially in North India, you would cover huge swaths of land, going in fact from Delhi all the way to Lahore. And so looking at your sample size and the number of towns and cities you're putting in, I wonder if you're defining these points as being too small. And this especially becomes a problem when you sort of have road networks that are growing and people moving from one place to another, and when you think of urbanization as something which is more of a macro phenomenon. So I would just encourage you to ask this question about when you're thinking of what a urban agglomeration is, and when you look at the nightlights data, what is the size of what you're getting at the end of it. And particularly in North India, I think it's very difficult to pinpoint the number of cities that you seem to be pinpointing.
Professor Mukherjee?
I like the emphasis on new firms and entrepreneurship, because I think that's really critical in understanding the growth of cities. But if you think about entrepreneurship, you may have one entrepreneur, and the human capital of the entrepreneur may be quite important. And if he's a successful entrepreneur, one entrepreneur may create a firm that creates 20 jobs for people with much lower levels of human capital, which might bring the whole average down. So looking at how it correlates with average human capital is not going to tell you much about the importance of human capital in entrepreneurship. Now, I think if you want to focus on entrepreneurs, the economic census is going to give you, I don't know how much not much information about the entrepreneur. I don't know if it gives you the education of the entrepreneur. I don't know whether it's possible to get data from people who put together the economic census on the origin, where does the entrepreneur come from? Social networks are very important in entrepreneurship. So it might help to know the origin or the caste of the entrepreneurs, but I don't think that information is available. One thing you could do to address some of these endogeneity, has caste information. Yeah, okay, so you could try to use that.
Yeah.
Caste and origin would tell you a lot.
But not origin.
Now the endogeneity concerns are obviously there, but I think it would be somewhat alleviated if you were to use something like a vector autoregression approach. So regress entry between, let's say, 2001 and 2011 on historical sort of stocks prior to 2001. And one of the things that might be important is, if you're looking at agglomeration, you want to see the stock of firms in the same sector, as well as in sectors which are vertically linked to that sector. You get an idea of the kind of externalities, the spillovers. Are they horizontal or are they vertical? As well as if you can then link it with firms that are coming from the same origin, the same caste, and so forth. But I think that would just be, would not alleviate the endogeneity concerns. It still would be vector autoregressions, but at least it would alleviate some of the endogeneity concerns and provide some insight.
Thank you. Anupam?
I'd also like to congratulate your attempt to make to the painstaking work, and I really appreciate the aspect of connecting the dots. The economic, the work is very similar to something done by Chinmay Thumbe. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, who's focused on migration and urbanization processes, and I think he actually he did this with TIS, and now is at IIM Ahmedabad in a series of papers. And my question is, how do your results or findings relate to him? Because they seem to be different. I obviously won't go. I have a little bit of a summary of some of the things that he has laid out, which seem to be not quite consistent with what you're saying. Two takeaways I had from reading his stuff is the important regional differences. And that's where he talks about, the North and South play out very differently, because I think, Pronab, you were there with the work. And what is happening is that the demographic processes in the North, decline, stagnant agricultural productivity, etc. you have, but at the same time, the higher human capital endowed male migrants are moving, but at the same time, there are also people who then bring their families but have lower fertility. So there are two different processes occurring, and quite distinct patterns emerge between the North and the South. So I'm just giving you one. That second big problem I see, and this comes back when I was at NASCOM, we took a number of exercises and looked at 40 cities in India, because we could always get all the states would want to know how to promote IT and so on. What was the potential? We started looking at the economic base, population, all those, and we found big differences that have occurred, and some of it is evident in terms of urban morphology what has happened in the mid 90s to 2005 and 2005 to 2015, for example, in the last 2 decades, because you think the Indian IT industry, and I would say beyond that, the modern services sector really took off only after 2004-5. You don't see any of it, for example, in the numbers. And that has been a primary driver of growth, especially in the 6 metropolitan areas, if you go through and look at some of the other numbers. Thirdly, I thought you were actually getting away from what I call the lamppost problem, and I've told this to Ijaz, so I can repeat it here, that that you were not going to be looking at just based on the statistics at a city level, but looking at the whole urban hierarchy. This is related to Rakesh's point that really, if you want to look at growth and regional dimension, you have to look at that. I have a couple of other things, but I would just add that there is another set of work which has been done by people even like Sanjay Chakravarti, etc., on land markets, where they've looked at certain major cities and what is growing and related to urban migration as well as economic structure. And I think you may want to bring that together too.
Thanks, Anupam.
I'm Rakesh Mohan. First of all, I wasn't very clear as to when you talk about growth of small cities, was it the growth rate of small cities or the growth in the number of small cities? I'm still not clear as to what is being addressed. The second point is that there are 2 stylized facts in this literature that I seem to remember, it would be good if you had started with those and tried to, use the data to see if it, it conforms to those facts. One is that the growth rate of cities is independent of size. So it's Gibrat's law. It's basically over the long haul, growth rates are independent of size. The other thing is the growth rate of cities is not continuous in size. And that is that when cities come up to a certain size, say you got an airport and you got a house, then it will go up to a next size. So it's not continuous. The sizes are not continuous. So so you have periods of very rapid growth in cities. Krugman's done some very good work on this. So when you talk about the growth rates of some cities being larger or this thing, you need to control as to what phase of the transition this is taking place. Finally, given that the growth rate is independent of size, you are obviously going to see, for a large city, you're going to see a lot more firms, etc., coming there than to a smaller city. And finally, I'd like to have seen some data comparing things. For instance, what fraction of economic activity is conducted in Indian cities. Like in the US, 85% of all production is carried out in cities, and over that, approximately the same number of people also live in cities. So I'm not sure, how these things work. Thank you.
Shekhar, and then Professor Mrs. Rajaraman. I don't see any other hands. Yeah.
Thank you, Krishnan. This is partly picking up on Suman's point and partly the motivation for nudging Rana and colleagues to do this work, and I'm really grateful that they've launched into this area. But it's also timely in some sense, and it's great to have Pronab Sen here. There are things that come out from your exercise that speak to how perhaps we should be looking at the census, additions, modifications, changes, and other sources of data, including our sample surveys. It'd be very good for somebody, I don't know, Pronab, you, Ideas for India, somebody to actually think about what does this tell us about the lacunae and about the things that we should be moving on to in order to make this exercise much more meaningful. So it'd be very nice if there could be some forum or way in which we could pick up some of the deficiencies and the difficulties that Rana and others have had and Debolina have had, and then reflect it back to CSO and NSSO and say, these are things that really should be looked at. So it'd be very good to see if we can encourage such a conversation.
Thank you.
I was searching in table 9 for, in your vector of infrastructure variables, for whether you have anything on sanitation, but you don't. So access to indoor toilets and so on. I would imagine that that would be extremely important.
Any other comments? Yes, sir. Professor Golder.
Golder, I wanted to make two observations. First is, generally the economic census data, there are some questions about that. Although this was based on economic census data and uses the compared to that, the annual survey of industries data are much more reliable. Of course, you have a difficulty that you want city-wise data, and that may not be easily available to researchers. But for annual survey of the industries data, which is the frame is I think available on the net, and frame contains all the, and because if manufacturing is one of the key factors driving, you get the entire universe of 10 plus workers available on the frame. But this is frame today. I don't know if you have the frame for earlier years. But so my suggestion would be that if frame could be used for the study.
Thank you. Shekhar, with your permission, I'll slightly depart from the guidelines. Since I don't plan to do a summing up, I have 3 observations. I thought I'll quickly make them and then call upon Rana to come back and respond to these in about 3 or 4 minutes. I have 3 points. Point 1 relates to data, not very relevant necessarily for the findings, but the urban infrastructure related data, and it's something you've known, something others have known, highly suspect for 2 reasons. And Devesh has, for instance, written about this. There is a whole incentive related issue. All this data within, for instance, the urban infrastructure data relating to roads, electricity, density, etc., is largely reported by urban local bodies and primarily for purposes of funding. So, as Secretary Urban, I have fudged this data endlessly depending on what is the current Government of India guideline. If funding is related to length of road in a positive way, we have included conservancy lanes in the definition of roads. If it was negatively correlated, we removed all the conservancy lanes. If you included public taps in the definition of coverage of water distribution, we removed public taps from our data, and we've done this endlessly, and this goes on. So it's not very material because you use this only sort of in passing in table 4, but I think you want to be cautious of this. And the second point is the fact that city growth here is measured by population growth and not by GDP, because you don't have city level GDP data. I think the mechanism of population growth that you have in mind, which you sort of partially articulate, not very explicitly, is that change in economic structure will attract new workers and lead to a growth in the population. Now, at the levels of economic activity that you show, for instance, the levels of economic activity that you show in table 2, isn't it likely that much of the new workers come from change of economic activity of the existing workforce? So the point I have in mind is this change in economic structure leading to expected migration perhaps occurs only after a much higher threshold of economic activity. And given your point on passive migration, my clear sense, and this comes out in the paper, economic structure is perhaps only a partial explanation for city growth. The third sort of quick caution that I want to sound, some others have mentioned it, I think Professor Pronab Sen mentioned it, this is caution that I have seen in literature on the subject, when you're trying to sort of foster agglomeration effects. I think there are many mechanisms which generate similar outcomes. So identifying precise sources of urban agglomeration and the associated outcomes is going to be difficult. Plus, in terms of, again, what I have seen in creation of an urban agglomeration, there is an enormous amount of politics. Bangalore city, the growth that you see in the period 1998, 99 to about 2004-5, which is a massive growth period of Bangalore, is almost entirely outside of the city of Bangalore. It's the 8 urban local bodies that surrounded Bangalore. Governments wanted it in that manner because these 8 cities were effectively governed relatively poorly. They had 10 staff, 12 staff. For instance, locations where Wipro and Infosys are located, entire municipality didn't have one town planner. So it was very easy to do pretty much what you wanted in terms of monkeying around with land regulations. But when the 8 local bodies were ruled by a party different from the city and different from the state government, suddenly these 8 were merged and the greater Bangalore was created. My sense is almost all these urban agglomeration creation, if you dig deep, there is a political story. So not directly relevant for the conclusions, but it's something you want to keep in mind. You have another 3 or 4 minutes now to respond.
By the way, the Bombay Municipal Corporation also has no urban planner. It never has had.
But urban planning is part of Bombay municipality. It's not so.
Bombay Municipal Corporation has no urban planner.
So Rana, over to you now.
No, thank you. As expected, great comments. I'll try to address a few and then. So first of all, on the migration issue, in some sense, if there's limited migration, no. Let me just back up and actually ask Devesh this question, because I think that it gets to the heart of the issue. As long as the census is in terms of a particular location, as long as it's capturing the people who are there, I think we're fine. Whether or not they're migrants or whether they're refusing to respond in another survey about migration doesn't really affect us. The migration stuff is just important for us in the sense that if you are in a world with or in India with no mobility whatsoever, then there's no real point doing this study, because all you're doing is you're trying to look at the relationship between whether they're endogenous, exogenous variables between birth rates and death rates and these things. So we actually need there to be migration, but we don't need this migration to be, we don't need mobility to be perfect, because then again, there's no point looking at these individual 2,400 towns. So in some sense, the migration issues are not all that pertinent to this kind of study. As long as you're not in a world of complete immobility or perfect mobility, this framework that we've used is okay. I mean, that's the way we've been looking at it. On the endogeneity, exogeneity, absolutely, we're completely guilty. But here I just want to thank Rohini for pointing out a very nice potential instrument. We'll definitely look into that one. And Dr. Gulda, your point about the urban frame, that's a great one. That I think it should be possible. As you said, the new frame is there on the web, and we could request CSO to see if we could get that frame. What we've done, and this was in the paper, we had heard. I mean, when we started off on this, a couple of people told us, look, economic census, don't use it, it's not reliable, etc. So one of the first things we did is we just looked at the total employment numbers we're getting from the NSS EUS and economic census. And what we found is that, yes, the totals vary quite a bit, and it tends to be driven by the below 10. So the census seems to be doing a reasonable job if you take the NSS as the better survey in capturing the larger. The problem seems to be at the lower end, where the NSS seems to do a very good job in listing every single establishment at that urban block or the village level before they sample the final units. I'm not exactly sure what we could do about that below 10, but on the 10 and above for manufacturing, your point is it's a great one. We'll look into this. Anand, your point on the what is a city? So sorry I rushed through this and all, but we actually don't use city lights at all. And even if we did, in fact, I was thinking that city lights is actually a very, it's a nice thing to do. It has its drawbacks, but I don't think one of the drawbacks is the one you were mentioning. You know, that just depends on what threshold you use for luminosity. So if you use a very, I think these go from an index of like 1 to 64. If you use 4 or 5, then you'll get the Delhi to Lahore as being one city, one agglomeration. But if you cut it off at 32, which seems to be what the recent research that's working on this, you get something closer to what we think of in terms of size. Now, we in the approach we're using, we're really constrained by what the census defines as a town or a city or urban agglomeration. Now, it would be interesting to see how these two compare. So the recent work that we cite uses this threshold of 32. You know, how much do they, whether they look similar or not. And now, just going back to Dr. Sen, Dr. Mohan's points, these are extremely useful. I think it also came up in the context of some other statements that in terms of setting up of this paper, maybe the way to do this would be really to look at the stylized facts that you get from the broader literature, move to the all India level, and then motivate it. I'm losing my train of thought. Do you guys want to come in, Ye or Debolina? Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, so on the city growth and initial size relationship. So we find it in the overall sample, and it really tends to be, I'm sorry, we in fact do not find it in the overall sample. So it's not orthogonal. So city population growth is not orthogonal to initial population sizes. And the growth here that we're working with is not number of towns, but just the population of these cities and towns. And where the breakdown is taking place is really these cities which have 100,000 or more people. So what we clearly...
You would expect at some levels to be breakdown because of punctuated equilibrium. Right?
Possibly. The point that you were making about the life cycle of a city could be explaining that. And it might be, I think it's a thing, it's worthwhile for us to...
But if you're addressing urbanization, wouldn't you look at the growth of new cities?
So what we do in this in our sample is you've got to be the minimum criteria is you've got to be a city as of 2001. So if it's a rural village which turns into a census town, we don't capture that. You've got to start off as a it's got to be a statutory town of at least 10,000 people. But even restricting to that subset, I think the point that you're making, it is definitely something that it would be interesting to look at, and we can. Although maybe more years would help.
Can I add on to
yeah.
this? Yeah, I think the point which you made is extremely important, and this comes out in the census 2011. It's cities in the group of 1 million to 5 million which have registered the maximum growth. And the reason for this is 2,530 new census towns have been added, and this grew all across the country, but the ones that mushroomed close to the statutory towns were put together, which were contiguous, into one urban agglomeration. So when you look at the statutory towns populations, you find depopulation in many, as for example in all the 7 class 1 cities of Kerala. But when you look at the urban agglomeration as a unit, there is very high rise of, very high growth rate of urban population. So this is the category which registered the maximum growth, and this is because of this factor. Census towns put together close to statutory towns to form an urban agglomeration.
Anything more?
I think maybe
That's
at this point
Toilets?
Yeah. Can I? Yeah. Toilets we could not include because this data is not there in this town directory, it's there in the household tables. So if we add this indicator to our sample, then because household tables do not give us data on all towns, especially below 100,000 population, our sample would have got reduced.
It's there in the village directory.
It's there in the village directory, but not in the town directory.
Okay.
But just on that, Mr. Krishnan's point actually worries me in some sense. That I wonder if that's again it's interesting that those are the 2 or 3 variables that we've used, where we expected to find something and just found nothing. This Pakka road density and electrical lines, where we constructed our own variable using the spatial stuff in different sources, you actually get quite plausible relationships.
Yeah, well, let's discuss it. There are other sources for this data, which are in the State Finance Commission reports. We will talk about it outside of this meeting. So you wanted to come in, sir?
Just 3 very quick points. One on migration, Devesh's point. Maybe one of the sort of one way one can put those 2 different kinds of objects together is one to really distinguish between net migration and gross migration. So there's a huge amount of rural to rural, urban to urban, and then rural to urban, and urban to rural. So it's sort of like other thing that I work on, like different net capital flows and gross capital flows between countries. Net capital flow is a very small fraction of gross capital flows. So I think that's one thing that that perhaps brings the two observations together. Second, I really believe that in India we spend far too much time on definitional issues to do with towns when trying to understand urbanization. The bald fact is that our urbanization is slow, whatever way you look at it. Look, our definition of a town in the census, a part of the statutory towns, is a very basic one. Population of 5,000 for God's sake, and of course 3/4 of occupation of the male being non-agriculture. So there's very little left out, and on top of that, of course, the statutory towns which do not conform to that particular definition. So given this definition, many of the different issues really don't matter in my view in terms of really trying to understand what's happening to urbanization in India. Yes, of course, at the local level it matters. If you're looking at a particular city or a particular town, those things matter. And third, finally, the real issues in my mind are to do with the anti-manufacturing policies and location of manufacturing in towns and cities. We've had very strong policies in the past, at least, which did not allow the location manufacturing in cities. I'm not quite sure what exactly has happened to those policies at the local level, at the state level, the city level, etc. But I think those are some of the issues that are really worth looking at.
Thank you. Shekhar, now over to you, the next announcement.
Thank you
Thanks
very much. Well, let's just give a round of applause to this. I think an excellent discussion, and thank you for chairing so well, Krishnan. So lunch, let's come back at 2 o'clock for the final session, which is a new experiment that we are doing, and we'll get a chance to reflect back on all the papers and the discussions we've had over the last day and a half. So 2 o'clock, please.